Hi, folks. I'm recording this on Monday, the 26th, in other words, before the election. And I'm sure that everybody's nervous about the elections. And while I can think of all kinds of interesting things I'd love to talk about, I think that you probably don't have the patience for having me babble on about, God knows, Nigeria or the START Treaty or anything like that. So today I'm going to confine myself to some very broad issues that have either arisen or not arisen in the elections and will be with us even after the election, just a kind of a framework for what's going on. But before I do so, I want to apologize for my last talk. In a way, I talked about Putin's front yard and backyard. And I keep mispronouncing the names of the various republics, like Azerbaijan. Sometimes I could pronounce it correctly, sometimes incorrectly. From that, you can see that my field of research was not East Europe or the Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union republics. I couldn't pronounce the names, so I studied some other part of the world. Anyway, I had made several plans earlier in the week to talk about this and that. And then on, I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, Steven Erlanger, who is a European correspondent in the New York Times, wrote an article which essentially was what I was going to talk about. And so I thought, all right, I'll switch gears slightly. And then on Thursday, Roger Cohen wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times where he said what I decided I was going to talk about. So and now you will think that I'm plagiarizing, but I do want to highlight some of what these guys had to say. Of course, all of us who observe the world can sort of see the same thing, and it's not surprising that everybody is sort of saying the same things. So one of the things that Erlanger talked about was to say that Trump has completely transformed the world. That is to say, the world of international politics. US decline in geopolitics, which we have talked about before, is now obvious. And whether Trump wins or Biden wins, both of them are living in a new world with the US playing a different and unaccustomed role. And this is going to be problematic even if Biden wins. The Europeans are beginning to realize this themselves, and there's a lot of talk in Europe about how Europe needs to adjust to the new role of the United States. And they're doing so because they're essentially saying that even if Biden were to win, Europe still has to adjust to playing a new role. Without belaboring details, let me just give you one illustration, and that is China. In the leaders in Europe, Macron, but also others, are essentially saying we are not going to go along with the US on its China policy. Because while Trump, of course, is weighing heavily in terms of China bashing, China brought us the virus and all the rest, even Biden is taking a fairly strong and potentially hostile line towards China. And the Europeans are saying to themselves, whoa, wait a minute, it's better to try to get along with China. Yes, criticize them when we should and when we must. But the world of the future in which China is going to be the major power is best dealt with if we are reasonable, if we don't overreact, if we find convergence when we can, for example, on climate change, and then be critical, let's say, in the area of human rights and so on. So Europe is, in a sense, positioning itself, both as the European Union and as individual countries, to diverge from US policy on China. And that's just one illustration. Now, what Roger Cohen was talking about, which is startling, I think if I read you the list, and I will in a minute, to realize all the things that are going on in the world which don't seem to be featuring in the election and which will have to feature post the election, again, irrespective of whether it's Trump or Biden. But if you just listen to the list, it is shocking that we've had a presidential debate in which, let me read you the list, the following items have not been discussed in either of the two debates: Syria, human rights, drones, democracy, inequality, dictatorship, Israel, Palestine, World Health Organization, Guantanamo, European Union, Brexit, France, Italy, Hong Kong, African states, South American states, terrorism, multilateralism, authoritarianism, and alliances. None of these topics were discussed if you were to review the last two awful debates in those debates. And that shows, in a sense, how much, the presidential candidates either don't want to discuss them or discuss any of them, or don't think it's necessary to discuss them, because that's not where Americans are at. And so when Cohen says that he calls it the shrinking of the American mind, he is saying something which I think is very right and which we are going to have to worry about in the future. Now, let me backtrack a little bit by saying foreign policy has never ranked among the top issues in American elections. By and large, when people are asked in polls, what are you most concerned about? They're most concerned about the economy. In this particular election, they're concerned about the COVID virus. But sometimes maybe race relations or terrorism, or in the past, the Soviet Union, and things like that. But foreign policy issues per se have never particularly featured. And one of the shocking things, of course, about us as the United States is that in spite of the fact that we were since the end of the post-World War II world and until recently, we were the dominant geopolitical power, right? You would think as a dominant geopolitical power, our fellow citizens would be somewhat knowledgeable about foreign affairs, would care about foreign affairs, would, in a situation where some major issue, whether it's the nuclear concern about nuclear warfare, whether it's China, whether it's Europe, whether this is Russia, that they would be fairly knowledgeable and fairly interested. And that has never been the case. That is to say, an elite in the United States, a business elite, a governmental elite, a academic elite, concerns themselves about these issues. But essentially, this is not what Mr. and Mr. America cares about. And it's not just that they don't seem to care about the issues, it's also that there is a lack of any kind of depth of knowledge, again, about any part of the world. I might have told you this before. When I taught international politics to upper division students, on the first day of class, I would have a 10-question quiz. And I would say, what is the capital of Canada? What is the neighbor to the south of the United States? Just fairly simple questions, right? And 80% of the students would get 7 or 8 out of 10 wrong. They were clueless. And these were the best and the brightest high school students who've already spent 2 years at a university. The others were totally knowledgeable. In other words, they had traveled, they lived in households, whatever, their parents, they were knowledgeable and they could ace them because they were really simple questions. But the majority of students couldn't answer any of these simple questions. And so if you ask somebody in Kansas, if you ask somebody in North Dakota, and you say, could you locate Italy or Spain on a map? The majority of people can't do that. And that is part of our education system. We don't really teach geography. We don't really much teach world history to most of our citizens. And because we're such a large country and we are so isolated, generally speaking, right? We're not in the middle of surrounded by neighbors who speak different languages, more than a couple anyway. It's understandable that Americans over the generations have gotten used to the fact that occasionally you have to care about foreign affairs because there's a war and you get drafted and so on. But even during the Vietnam War, most Americans couldn't locate Cambodia, for example, and weren't exactly sure, is that a country and where might it be and what role it was playing and so on. So this is a kind of historical artifact in terms of the US role in the world. But it's now gotten to the point where even the elite, that is, say, even people running for government, for president, don't think that in national debates, any of the issues which are high, important issues in world affairs even have to be addressed, or that they have to express a policy in a debate or show differences amongst each other in a debate. And this is rather shocking. And it's shocking, you know, to Roger Cohen, who has a kind of French-American perspective on the world, but it's also shocking to lots of other people. And it is very shocking to our allies. How little concern we seem to have. Now you can say I'm exaggerating that, you know, in speeches, Biden has brought up climate change, and every now and then there is some modest discussion about something like climate change. But by and large, when pollsters ask Americans how important they think climate change is to the future of their life, it doesn't feature in the top 3, 4, 5, 10 categories, even though during this particular election, we lived at a time of hurricanes and floodings and fires and global warming and so forth. Now in California, of course, we're sensitized to the fires and the droughts and things like that. But as a national phenomenon, I overgeneralize, I suppose, to make a major point that we're not addressing it. And therefore, if you would to ask, let us say at a news conference, the two presidential candidates, what exactly they're planning to do about Syria, and you would ask Americans whether the various pronouncements that Trump and Biden have made on Iran, what they would do, to have more fleshed out knowledge about what the upshots is, what the trade-offs are, and so forth. It really doesn't really register. And so one of the things that is happening is that in a way that didn't happen before, the Europeans, the European unions, and other parts of the world are now concluding we may have to pretty much step up to the plate now. Now that in itself, of course, plays into Trump's hands, who says, you know, they're not paying their equal share in NATO, and I got them to play, a role in NATO by paying more into NATO. So in that sense, NATO has come up. But what exactly NATO does and what exactly NATO should be doing right now in the Middle East and in other places with respect to Turkey, for example, and various kinds of difficulties that Turkey is creating in the Middle East, that is not on the list of discussions. And if you were to push Biden, let's say, he might have quite a few things to say about where the US would come down on some of these issues. Would he, if he were president, what would he be saying to Turkey right now? If he were president, what would he be saying about, I don't know, Iraq, let's say, Iran? Lebanon hasn't come up at all. Lebanon is in a state of close to anarchy. It is a total mess. he might have views because he has been, prepped to respond to questions, but he knows that unless he asks a question, he doesn't have to say anything about it because Americans simply don't care. Now, you could say, well, while we were the major power in the world, somebody took care of these policies and we didn't really have to care because we're the most powerful country in the world and we dominated, and so what? But since we are a shrinking power in the world, or if I can even put in the present, we have, or in the past, we have already shrunk, right? It behooves us to now identify areas in which we believe our national interest lies, because our national interest is not a global interest anymore. And I think that's even going to be the case under Trump. I'm sorry, under Biden. That is to say, the foreign policy under Biden will be more sophisticated. He would restore some seasoned personnel to the State Department. We could expect lots more international engagement of one sort or another. But we'll be doing so, or Biden would be doing so, essentially in a new world, in a world in which he would get resistance. He would get resistance from the European Union. He would get resistance, ongoing resistance from all kinds of countries in the world, which now say, okay, we are also playing a more prominent role. And now you're going to have to compromise with us. You can't just get your way anymore, US. And in that sense, both Erlanger and Cohen were absolutely right. That is to say that the world order has shifted underneath our feet while we weren't watching. And while many things can be restored under Biden, and we certainly would have a better foreign policy, in my humble view, it is also the case that we are in a new world order in which our role in the world will have rather drastically changed, I would say, and will change. Now, let me give you a kind of a small illustration of something. Our closest ally, we have been saying for decades, right, or years and years, it has been the United Kingdom, right? And we speak the same language, we have connected in terms of democracy and all kinds of things. The person in power now, Johnson in England, is in fact an ally of Trump, and his government is a very right-wing government, which finds itself more congenial with Trump's policies, right? And while on a daily basis, we may not be necessarily consulting with the United Kingdom anymore, it is also the case that the one government in at least Western Europe that we feel warm and fuzzy about during the Trump administration is the United Kingdom and its prime minister. And for that matter, you may recall when we talked about Brexit, one of the few European countries to weigh in favor of Brexit was Trump, right? European Union was trying to keep United Kingdom as part of Europe, and it still is in negotiation whether they'll completely drop out or whether there will be some kind of agreement in the next few weeks. But be that as it may, the fact is that Trump lobbied for the UK to leave the European Union. He's against multilateralism, he's against the European Union, and so forth. And so is Johnson and Johnson's government. So if Trump were to win the election, England, the United Kingdom, would at least part, or London, England at least as part of the United Kingdom, would be delighted because they would have an ally in their opposition and in their disaggregation from Europe. If Trump were to win, it would be totally different because, of course, if Biden were to win, if Biden were to win, it would be entirely different because, of course, Biden favored UK staying in the European Union, and anybody he would bring into government would be pro-European Union. Well, that means that the close alliance that the US has had in some ways with England and its prime minister under Trump will in fact no longer exist. So our closest ally will, as long as the current English administration is in power, feel somewhat more alienated from the US under a Biden administration than it did under Trump administration. So this is a kind of an ironic twist, right? That in point of fact, Europe will breathe a sigh of relief if Biden gets elected. In the current British government, will feel quite alienated from a Biden government, and Biden will have to work very hard to remind at least the citizens of England and any future England that they are still, or they still ought to be, our closest ally. Now, I'm describing this and you're saying, well, why are you boring us with this? Because after all, the US is still somewhat mighty. And so if we feel under a Biden administration, the current English government will somewhat feel alienated, it doesn't really make all that difference. And I would propose to you it makes a lot of difference, because there are a lot of links between the United States and Britain. For example, in intelligence gathering, for example, attitudes towards nuclear matters, arms, the development of commercial airlines, all kinds of things in which we've been working hand in glove historically with Great Britain, and working with them has functioned reasonably well under the Trump administration, insofar as the Prime Minister of England was willing to continue some of these alliances. It'll be much more difficult to share security and so forth for a Biden administration with a right-wing current English administration. So there are funny twists and turns with respect to England, which are really quite serious. Though in most other parts of the world, I think there will be a sigh of relief. Finally, I just want to say one more word about multilateralism. The Trump administration and Trump during the debates have, of course, smashed all multilateral aspects of US. We are America first. We do exactly what we want to do. We don't need alliances and all the rest. While Biden, of course, is pro-alliances and has spoken up in favor of pro-alliances, especially in news conferences and in one-to-one interviews. The concern about alliances and the concern about multilateralism is viewed very seriously around the world. And the decline of the United Nations is viewed as really, really very serious around the world. And while the Trump administration has expressed little or no interest, the folks that have moved in to play a more powerful role have, of course, been China and Russia and other countries whose interests are different, or in many ways, than the United States' interests. So I just, before I close, just want to illustrate with something for us to keep our eyes on in the post-election. So since the US has defunded so many UN agencies, World Health Organization, World Trade Organization is in a mess, and so forth. The Chinese in particular have had more leverage in the UN, in the Security Council and elsewhere, because we've been out to lunch. And one of the things that they have argued is to switch the focus of human rights away from political and religious rights and onto economic rights. And that is really a very interesting topic, which we should talk about down the road, because for years now, the problematic for people seeking asylum and for refugees has not necessarily been that they were political refugees or religious refugees, but rather that they were refugees from economic situations and warfare, which made their life unviable, right? So in order to get asylum, they have to drum up that in Latin America or Central America, for example, some gangs were accosting them and so forth, because under the human rights provisions that came out of the Second World War, it was not economic distress, but it was political and religious distress, which gave people access to asylum. So down the road, I think I would like to discuss this topic, but it's a topic that has not gotten any attention at all in the sort of clamor for different kinds of human rights, or the addition of human rights has created a vacuum which the Chinese have moved in. And while it's good to add what the Chinese are asking for, it is not good what the Chinese are trying to abstract from human rights. And surely human rights is one of the things that the US will have to address, or at least Biden would have to address if he were to become president, because as you know from watching TV news, the US immigration policies are appalling. And one of the most appalling aspects of the last few days is that many of the foreign doctors who were not green card holders but had visas, which are now keeping people alive in American hospitals, it was said 2 days ago that those visas would be withdrawn. In other words, they would be sent home. The fact that this is not major news in major newspapers is really to be I don't know, feel disgusted about. But it just goes to show how we are so focused on COVID, which is, of course, right. And we are so focused on this limited amount of stuff that is being discussed during this election, that post the election, either, no matter what the outcome, we have some not only major crisis, but we have to do some major rethinking. And one of the rethinking, I think, is that we need some serious fireside chats, if Biden were to win, to discuss how the US reconfigures its role in the world. Because while we weren't watching, our role has fundamentally changed, and it can't really be reversed. It can only be amended here and there, made slightly better here and there, and we need to all work on that. Anyway, happy election. Please, if you haven't voted, vote. If those of you who filled out mail envelopes, there is a box at the courthouse, which is very safe and very efficient. And I'll talk to you after the election. Good luck to us all. Thank you.